The talk is not, it's how it just
Things are very active. Things are great.
Okay, it's my pleasure to begin the first seminar in the RusNet network of this academic year, and I'm glad that the disagreements I had with the kitchen knife in my house have not stopped me from being able to be fit and healthy. I thank the Norwegian healthcare system, which is to say that it's much more efficient than the British healthcare system would be to say that Russia has some problems with corruption, i.e. a massive understatement. But it would be our speaker, David Shakori, who would be able to tell us the most about such things. He is the co-founder, amongst many things, of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. He is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. He is co-director of Ponar's Eurasia. And as is customary when introducing these events, I also forget to say that my name is Matthew Blackburn, and I work here as a senior researcher at NUPI. This event is also being streamed on YouTube, so please be aware of that. So return to our speaker, who I'm very glad that we managed to welcome here, and it's all going ahead. As I said, he is really well, received his PhD in political science from Columbia University at the well-known Harriman Institute. When he pursued his research agenda, he also worked closely with the Higher School of Economics, Andrei Yakovlev, and the International Center of Studies of Institutions Development. I mention that merely just to point out there were happier times when a lot of very important data sets were collected on institutions and elites in Russian politics. Sadly, that's no longer possible, but David has undoubtedly benefited from that, and his academic research agenda is quite broad, covering corruption, clientelism, political economy in Russia, and Western Europe and the United States. He is the author of 2 books of particular interest, one of which I read when I was still a postdoc at Uppsala, Politics for Profit, Business, Elections, Policymaking in Russia, which came out in 2020. And building on that, on questions of democratic manipulation, electoral sabotage, the second book just came out this year. Congratulations, Workplace Politics, How Politicians and Employers Subvert Elections, which came out this year at Oxford University Press. And today, David is basically presenting on a book which is, I guess, more or less written, and it's going to be sent out for a proposal, entitled The Technocrats. So without any further words from my side, I will pass the floor to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone at the Institute, for having me out and being so flexible with my crazy travel schedule. It's great to be able to share some research and get your feedback and have a discussion about contemporary Russian politics. As Matthew said, this is based on a book manuscript that will be under review imminently by a publisher. So everything you say can still be integrated into the book. It's not too late. I haven't just surprised you with the finished manuscript, but the goal is to have it out and published sometimes next calendar year. But you know, with publishing, it could take 4 years by the time they get the paper and the ink and all things like that. So the book is called The Technocrats. This talk will be on about half of the book, which is on Russia. And I try to focus the talk on the things that we can learn from it about the way that Russian politics has worked under President Putin, and also a little bit about the future of elite cohesion going forward. So it makes a kind of central claim, and there will be a fair amount of data, but it won't be inaccessible. So I'm going to present some slides, some new statistics and data on a lot of these dynamics, as well as complement it with some stories. But the main trend that I'm trying to identify and explain in the book is this rising technocratic presence in Russia over the last 25 years, which is quite puzzling, especially from an academic perspective, where the regime has become more personalist. It's become more concentrated around the figure of President Putin. At the same time, the percentage of high-level Russian officials with Western education or experience in multinational firms or work at really credible independent think tanks has more than doubled in the 25 years that Putin has come into office. At the same time, you see this trend downward in the number of siloviki, people with experience in the security agencies that are occupying similarly high-level positions in ministries, agencies, services, and across the presidential administration and the government. So these kind of convergent trends, Russia's not an outlier, and I'll talk about how this is happening in dictatorships around the world, that people with advanced, high-quality education are going and propping up these regimes. But the book is really about how and why this is happening in Russia and what the consequences are for governance and the war and regime stability going forward. But of course, you're thinking, how would you define such a technocratic education? Technocrat is a word that just gets tossed around, especially by journalists, to try to describe this mode of thinking or expertise. And it's hard to come up with a definition. I know if you're a doctor or a business person based on what companies are registered or where you got your education. Where technocrat is a little bit more fluid, and I want to apply a definition that's really not specific to the Russian setting, but appropriate for it, to kind of capture what I think are relative differences in competence between different types of officials. So I'm not arguing that just because you graduated from university like University of Oslo or George Washington University that you're somehow objectively good. And I have lots of students that come out with degrees from my university that still have a lot more to learn about how the world works. But in a context like Russia or other dictatorships or kleptocratic settings, there are differences in the way that officials can handle problems and solve them, incorporate evidence, and come to higher quality decisions. And I want to argue that that's a function partly of the background that they bring to their positions. In that Russian case, there's a substantial number of officials, even now in wartime Russia, where these characteristics are prominent among these high-level leaders. And I'm going to draw consistently on a data set that's just newly constructed called the Political and Economic Elites of Russia, which is about 1,600 people. So this is everybody down to the deputy minister level in Russia, including heads of agencies, services, and so forth. So it's a substantial number of individuals, and I've got basically everything we can figure out from them on the internet, which is a lot. So their education, their career experience. I'll talk today about their financial disclosures, the money that they own, the cars that they drive, and much, much more. So it's really detailed micro-level data on individuals. But I've also talked with as many people as I can in exile, and over Zoom, in person, over the last year, to make sure that this isn't just a data-driven study, that it's grounded in reality and that the people are backing up some of the claims I'm going to make today. So there's a little bit about methodology, but I'll jump straight away to the findings and the claims. So like I said, this is not specific to Russia. It's actually more prominent in dictatorships around the world. Right now, 1 in 4 cabinet ministers in authoritarian regimes has been educated in the West and has a graduate degree. So this is something that's more than tripled since the 1960s. And if you follow China, for example, there was a great article last month in the Wall Street Journal that so many officials were trained at the Harvard Kennedy School that they called it the party school because the Communist Party was so well represented in Harvard. We're talking tens of thousands of people just from China at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm sure you've sometimes studied along people. If you're professors in the room, you might have educated some of these people who went back to their own countries and may not necessarily be bringing the liberal values that they learned abroad back to their home countries and are now integral cogs of dictatorial regimes, and Russia's included, but it's actually kind of lagging a little bit behind some of its peers that are more advanced in the way that they've brought really professional people into government. So the book, more broadly, the argument is just that autocracies can and do rely on competent officials. It's a little bit of an academic debate, the idea that dictators prefer the loyal over the competent. They like to have their relatives, their cronies, their brothers-in-law, their cousins around them. I come from a country that's currently undergoing some anti-democratic changes, to put it lightly, and if you watch our cabinet meetings, you'll see a lot of sycophantic behavior and a lot of people that are less than qualified for the positions that they're holding. And the idea then is that dictators don't want to surround themselves with people that are going to make them look bad or contradict some of their worst ideas, embarrass them, or even maybe take over power in some instances by saying, I'm more capable, I'm more qualified to hold these positions. But I want to really focus this talk on how this applies in Russia, right? I understand all of you are probably more interested in Russia than you are in all dictatorships around the world. So what does this insight and a lot of the other research that I've done, what does that teach us about the way that the Russian state works? So kind of unsurprisingly, the first claims were that dictatorships like in Russia benefit immensely from empowering technocrats. And I'm approaching this not through the lens of modernization or growth. I don't think these people are brought in to revolutionize society and make people wealthier and happier and have a higher standard of living. I'm really making the argument that you bring on a technocrat and a really smart person because you want to stay in office longer and you want to develop tools of repression and surveillance that allow you to project power over the long run. So smart people are brought in to help dictators stay in power, not necessarily to modernize the country, although that sometimes happens depending on how much autonomy they get. The second is that these people can be disruptive, and they can introduce policies that hurt your ability to engage in corruption, make things more efficient. Maybe they can start a faction that starts to oppose certain types of political developments in your country. So you got to be really careful about bringing in really professional people into your cabinet or into your other agencies because they might screw things up that you spent a lot of time building. So that the second argument is really that regimes like in Russia, but especially the Putin regime, has mastered the use of carrots and sticks, financial and material incentives, but also punishments to recruit, surveil, and control competent officials, that they're really under disproportionate and exceptional scrutiny, but as I'm going to show you, they do really well, and they're well compensated for their time in office, and I'll make some arguments about why that's the case. The third one, of course, is more relevant to contemporary politics after the full-scale invasion in 2022. I'm going to argue that technocrats had most of the exit doors closed to them, but maybe a little bit counterintuitively, they had a lot more reasons to stay, and that they benefit potentially from staying in the long run. And I'll get to that argument. Maybe I'll leave a little bit of surprise in why that's the case. Then the fourth one is a little bit more policy relevant and a jumping off point for the discussion after the talk is that I'm going to make an argument, a suggestion that trapping human capital inside dictatorships may prolong regime survival. So think about the implications of that for sanctions policy, that if dictatorships are now more reliant on high levels of human capital, forcing it to stay inside the country could actually have an unintended consequence on regime durability, and we might want to experiment with different ways of reducing the amount of human capital in dictatorships, because in the long run, we might all be better off rather than forcing it to stay inside. But that, of course, is a very contentious and debatable topic, and I'm looking forward to kind of that exchange of ideas in the discussion. So getting back into the first question, so why do dictators trust technocrats with authority? There might be some weird bullet points. It looks like it's been converted, so apologies. I don't have a weird stylistic preference. The book is really arguing that it's harder to govern in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century, right? That things have become more complex and challenging and complicated. Globalization has made economic competitiveness one of the main features of growth and innovation, and it's just harder. You can't just give ministerial posts to completely unqualified relatives anymore, and your citizens, as they grow wealthier, start to expect more from the state, both in democracies and in autocracies. So a big reason that dictators around the world are turning to these professional people is because they need them. They provide a service that's pretty essential to making basic government services run and function. And at Russia, if you've been or observed the last couple of decades, it's pretty obvious that there are lots of upgrades, but there's also higher expectations from the citizenry about what the state should provide. And technocrats provide that type of performance legitimacy that in the post-Cold War period is really critical. You can't just say I'm a communist or nationalist or religious leader like you could 50 years ago and have people fall in line and believe that you're doing good things for the country. You have to show and demonstrate, not everywhere and maybe not the same high level, that you're trying, or that you're trying to develop state capacity to respond to citizen needs. And I think the Putin regime fits this pattern quite well. And I talk a lot in the book about how there's been this obsession, at least publicly, and Putin in his various posts over the last 3 decades, with preventing a repeat of the 1998 economic crisis. He cites this very often, both as prime minister and as president, about how economic crisis is delegitimizing and potentially really disruptive for his own ability to keep United Russia and the rest of his government in power. And that a lot of the policies, especially with regard to bringing in this technocratic expertise, are geared in terms of reducing the downstream and disastrous consequences of economic crisis that keeps hitting Russia periodically, both self-imposed and externally imposed. And I think, importantly, this delegation to technocrats has really proven its worth, right? There's this idea that their track record has helped to solidify their presence in office, and over time, Putin has come to trust them. And I think he is very, not accountable, but I think appreciative of a lot of the work that technocrats have done to solve this first bullet point, and that kind of reinforces a lot of his trust in technocrats over time. So I think this idea has worked out for him, and he's learned that this is a pretty good strategy. But there's also a room or a role for idiosyncrasies, and it's not just in Russia. That you think about a leader that's got a ton of power invested in the person, some people think they know everything, right? They think they don't need help. They think that their group is sufficiently qualified, and there's no need to bring in outside experts or outsource anything because we know what we're doing. And there are a lot of dictators worldwide that have this mindset. Think of Maduro and Chavez in Venezuela really thought that a bunch of colonels could run the economy in Venezuela and the oil industry, and it turned out that was really far from reality, and it basically destroyed that country over the last 2 decades. Even someone like Erdogan, a more would-be authoritarian, insisted that lowering interest rates would also lower inflation, right? Just crazy ideas in the heads of really powerful people who don't believe experts are unfortunately quite common in these regimes. Putin, I think, has developed an appreciation for expertise, but also, for example, maybe just be bored with domestic policy and much more interested in foreign affairs. So there's some specific personality traits, which I don't want to go too far into what is Putin thinking, but I think we need to carve out space that when you put so much power in one person, there's some unpredictability and individualism that comes out in that, and I think Russia's a good case that it may just be if there was somebody else besides Putin, you wouldn't have the same type of growth over technocratic expertise. And there may be something about him that is more open to this type of delegation and divide and conquer strategy. And we need to be aware of that rather than just dismissive of the fact that because he makes bad decisions, horrible decisions in the foreign policy realm, that he is misguided in other parts of the government. And I think that's probably not the right way of thinking about this. So yeah, I just talked about Chavez and Maduro, right? Their track records are quite, the 2 countries are more similar than you might think. They're really dependent on oil wealth. They came to power at very similar times. The democracy existed in both countries to varying forms and was destroyed and decimated through attacks on institutions and corruption and a lot of other parallel dynamics. But the Chavez-Maduro team had technocratic ministers and basically kicked him out of office within the first couple of years. And Chavez was almost deposed in a coup, and in response, he basically got rid of all the engineers that were running the national oil company. So they suffered from that lack of expertise. And his cabinets were full of family members and military cronies. This is a really stark contrast with 2 regimes that were both hit by foreign sanctions and both rocked by changes in the oil price. But I'm not trying to say that the outcomes in Russia are exceptional, right? That they've done a fantastic job of growing the state. Obviously, that's not true. But right now, Venezuela and Russia are in really different places, even though both are under really, really painful sanctions. And I think it's part of that reason is because the Putin regime has been more open to expertise and to making higher quality decisions rather than trusting really, really wild individuals with power in the Maduro and Chavez regime. So these are the type of comparisons that the book is trying to make, that how does Russia fit into our larger thinking of the way that authoritarian regimes work. So let's get into the juicy stuff. Why, if you had a graduate degree from a Western education, would you go and work for a brutal, corrupt, repressive regime that might really hurt you in the long run, especially professionally? I mean, probably many of you have advanced degrees and you've never considered working for such an evil institution, whether any government around the world, right? So why do people in these countries decide that this is the career path for them? So this is data from 2021, the Declarator project, which I helped develop over the last 7 or 8 years, which collects income and asset disclosures for all Russian officials. We're up to about 2 million individuals in the data set, but this is just high-level ministers and heads of agencies. I know, and I will show you, that there's a lot of things they don't declare in these disclosures. I'm not naive to think that an official document submitted to the public reflects all of their assets, but it does give us a little bit of insight into trends over time and comparisons between different groups. And that measure of technocrats that I talked about before, they're making roughly 18 million rubles in 2021. The last year we have data on the eve of the war, which is about 40% more than other people, whether they be Siloviki or other types of bureaucrats. So the argument is that technocrats have enjoyed a wage premium over the last 10 years that has helped to compensate for the reputational risk of working for this government, which maybe in 2013, 2014 didn't seem as bad. But over time, you get entrenched, and the money helps kind of swallow that bitter pill and trap people within the regime. I think it's most illustrative. This is a plot of how incomes of technocrats versus non-technocrats have evolved over time. And you can see in the pre-Crimea period that they're basically the same. There's no difference between having a Western education or multinational experience and not. You're going to make basically the same before 2014, and then that gap just explodes. And from an econometric standpoint, this is one of the strongest difference in difference that I've ever run in my life, that there is a massive premium on technocratic expertise in high-level institutions, so that they're compensating Western education that they're yelling against, criticizing, saying, you know, if you have ties to the West, you're a fifth column. But when you look at the disclosure data in the post-2014 period, when things got really rough, it became a lot more controversial to work for the government. It was doing things that were really disagreeable, to put it mildly. The technocrats started to gain more financially, and that's just apparent in these official documents. And I'll show you that it's not just their income. They also drive really nice cars. One of the big insights of the book is that just because you have a fancy liberal education doesn't mean you're more honest or less corrupt than somebody else. I'm not arguing that you're more corrupt, but I'm arguing that you're just a normal part of the elite when it comes to consumption and corruption patterns. So on these disclosures, we know the make and the model of all of their vehicles and even the year. So with a lot of data processing and parsing, I'm able to assign a value to all the cars that they own and drive over this period. And also just show you the raw statistics that technocrats are just as likely to drive Mercedes, Jaguars, Bentleys, Aston Martin. Sometimes they like certain car models more than others, but it's not like they're living the life of humble public servants just trying to improve Russia. They're enjoying the same country houses. They're getting the same access to apartments. They're driving the same fancy cars, some of which are completely unaffordable based on their income. And that type of, they're part of the elite and not separate from it. And they, in that sense, they're just as compromised as other people in the elite because they benefited so materially from the Putin regime. And I make the argument that this is a strategic move, right? Like if you're going to run a government such as Putin's, it's the one cop you can't trust is the honest cop. So you've got to get everybody involved in corruption because if you decide to invade a neighboring country, it's nice to be able to blackmail people and prevent them from leaving. And the data in the pre-war period really shows that technocrats have had a quite nice life in Russia. And I'm not trying to say that they're not there somewhere in their mind. There's no public service motivation. That I think they are generally committed to improving Russia, but think about your own career choices. There's a mix between what we might call intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You say you're not concerned with money, but it's impossible not to think about money when you decide what you want to do with your life. I think it's true for technocrats too, and I really want to emphasize that they're not these kind of holier-than-thou public servants, that money seems to matter, especially if you're making maybe close to what you could in the private sector, and that the government is adjusting its compensation based on potentially how risky or how damaging it is to work for it. And I think that's really important to understand personnel dynamics over time. So then how do you control these people, right? Like, in extreme events, you can think of Saakashvili as a technocrat who mounted a coup against an incumbent dictator. It's a rare event that a technocrat tries to overthrow you, but it's not impossible. Technocrats can also join factions and say, well, you're trying to overthrow the government. I can help you run the central bank if you ever get in power, and they can lend credibility. So it's not a group of people that you want to necessarily isolate or ignore because they're quite capable and they're quite attractive to people that are trying to challenge you. And they also pass policies. If you give them enough autonomy, they're going to do things that might disrupt a lot of the bribe-taking or embezzlement or corruption that keeps your state together, and that could really aggravate a lot of other people inside the regime. And also think that every minister post that you give to somebody with a Western education is one that you can't give to that relative or to that buddy that you think is really important. So there are trade-offs in empowering technocrats. And I'm really going to argue that in the case of Putin, this is reflected in the way that bureaucratic control has been constructed over the last couple decades. That we're going to see some really interesting patterns into how technocrats are screened and distributed across the government, how they're monitored, and how they're punished for crimes, we'll call them, broadly speaking. So the first is that, probably not surprising, technocrats are never given control over the security agencies over the last 25 years. We're talking 0 technocrats in charge of 46, or there's been 46 people that have run various agencies and services and ministries. Start with the Department or the Ministry of Defense and go all the way down into law enforcement, you know, all those crazy agencies that are exporting arms or doing anything related to defense, right? A broad definition of the silavi strutturi, right? There's never been somebody with a Western education to run any of these things in the last 25 years. And you might think, oh, Belousov, he got into power last year. He's actually not a technocrat under this definition. I can talk about that. It's, you know, a lot of it for data reasons, so you just don't think I'm hand-picking people to fit my definition. I will talk about him in the next slide because he fits the monitoring category. But you know, there's a couple people like Belousov that just never really went to the West. But until Belousov, even inclusive of 2024, there was just never anybody who was ever allowed to run any of these things. And now that he is in that position, he's under very close scrutiny by a cousin of Putin, who was made a deputy minister at the same time he was. So there's some interesting dynamics there. But what's interesting is that the Siloviki, having a background in the FSB or the KGB, doesn't prevent you from running other ministries, right? So there's this idea that, like, it's not just that technocrats aren't allowed, it's like they could run these things. And Belousov, I think, is a good case of this, but there's been, I think, an intentional decision to restrict their access, and I have a lot of good quotes in the books, even some close to Putin, you know, to illustrate this. It's not just Russia, this is all around the world. The dictators just don't give these type of defense-related positions to people with Western education. So I don't think Russia's an exception here, but I think it's a really illustrative case. The next is, I won't talk too much about monitoring. I can do a little bit in the Q&A. I kind of hinted at the idea that if you get control over a ministry, you get a trailer, a political commissar, and I have the data to show that technocrats are closely monitored by people, whether they're, you know, bodyguards or family members or even people from the security services. There's this careful scrutiny. The next is I gathered all of the anti-corruption prosecutions of high-level officials over the last close to 3 decades, and just kind of calculated what happens to people if they're ever investigated for corruption by the government. So of course, who knows if there was corruption happening or the specific type of corruption that they're under investigation. But like, let's think about how technocrats might be disproportionately affected. Now, the numbers of people that have been busted for anti-corruption are not large, right? So we have to be a little careful when we handle these numbers. We're talking about 62 out of 1,600 people over the last 25 years. So I'm not trying to claim that there's a real concerted, diligent anti-corruption effort going on, but I will say that if you are a technocrat and you're investigated for corruption, there's a 100% chance that you will go to jail at the end of the criminal process, right? There's all these things that happen in the Russian judicial process when cases get halted. For example, you might be investigated, but then not charged with a crime. Or if you're charged with a crime, you might not be convicted. Or if you're convicted, you might be put out on house arrest and never have to go to jail. If you're a technocrat, every single one, they've been sent to jail, and on average, they still spend longer periods in jail, and this is including Ivanov and all of the attacks on the Ministry of Defense that are in that second column. So this is inclusive of everything that happened in the spring of last year. Whereas if you're another type of official and you've been investigated for corruption, maybe you've got better protection with your patronage network, or maybe there's just you don't have the signaling value to the rest of the networks in Russia that you're not being made an example of, there's about a 45% chance, if you multiply all these percentages down, of going to jail. So you're over twice as likely, or 100% likely, if you're a technocrat in the last 25 years, to be punished through the anti-corruption procedure. Again, I don't want to make too much out of small numbers, but I think you can think of cases like Abizov and Ulyukayev, which have a lot of demonstrative value, and there's just a pattern emerging about technocrats being treated differently than the rest of the population. Next up, why do they remain loyal during crises? There were very few that ran for the exits. We all were saddened by the kind of inertia in Russian officialdom after the full-scale invasion in 2022. And there's a lot of kind of non-exclusive explanations for why people didn't leave. I'm not trying to argue that there's one reason. There's obviously not. And even for a single person, there were probably multiple reasons. Okay, so I'm not trying to say that my contribution or my explanation overpowers or outranks other reasons. Okay, we can't go into people's heads, and I'm not even sure people understood the one reason of why they stayed. But obviously there's a fear of repression, there's death threats, and a lot of horrific violence that either was implied or executed against people that challenged the regime in the aftermath, and I don't want to make light of that or say it didn't matter. I think I've talked a little bit about how they had comfortable lives in this country, and they were making a lot of money. They also owned real estate empires that you can't sell overnight, so there's financial costs, and you lose that status and that privilege that you've worked your entire life with. And it's hard to give up and put that in the West, where things were really more uncertain, and you're just really going to struggle to integrate into foreign societies. I think there is a sense of moral obligation, a sense of duty. This is more in their own words, right? How they explain their decision. There's fantastic reporting by a number of journalists and analysts that got to talk to a lot of technocrats, and really can show you that, yeah, they thought that they were going to make the lives of ordinary Russians better if they stayed and prevent things from getting worse, and they did feel an obligation. Again, I don't want to minimize that. I think it's true for some people. That said, I think, again, people have a mix of different motivations, and we have to understand them completely. The one that I'm going to introduce here, which hasn't been talked about as much, is this idea that if you're a technocrat, you're better off keeping your head down because there's a high probability of nothing happening to you if the regime would ever fall. So if you remember in the aftermath of the war, there was a lot of talk about how central bank governors and ministers were going to face a Nuremberg-type tribunal when all this was over, and were labeled Nazis, or the same as Nazi collaborators, for their inability to break with Putin's regime at this time. There's a lot of reporting about Nazism being invoked as a way of kind of labeling technocrats and their complicity, and also potentially threatening them with consequences when all this was over. Like, we haven't forgotten you. There will be punishments at the end of the day if you choose to do so. In the book, I argue that that punishment is highly improbable, that the technocrats in Nazi Germany were not punished. If anything, they were acquitted, and that Russia does not have a history of lustration or any type of transitional justice, and that around the world, if you're a technocrat and your regime collapses into democracy, you're almost 60% likely to work in the next government, because obviously the next government needs smart people to run the institutions. And that people in all these regimes, both after democratic transitions and regime shakeups, differentiate from highly competent versus less competent people and are much more open to forgiveness and to moving forward in continuity than maybe we'd like to admit to ourselves. So that long-term perspective, that if I just keep quiet during the war, there might be a role for me in a future democratic or authoritarian Russia, and that I won't pay a personal cost for my decision. And I've got data from interviews with Russian exiles, the most fervently oppositionist people in the world that have given up their lives and left Russia and are fighting to change Russia, are extremely open to technocrats joining a new administration if they were ever to return and unseat Putin. So there's a lot of quotes in the book. I was very generously given access to this Outrush project, which I'm sure you're aware of, surveys of Russian migrants. I have a survey out in Russia as well to try to get at these questions, but this is a huge selection bias, right? These are the people that are most angry at Russia and probably want to change Russia most dramatically. And they have a lot of nice things to say about Nabulina and a lot of other people within the economic bloc. Smart, useful people. She's a great specialist. She could do a lot of good. Selective lustration is needed, but we really love her, for example. Of course, we understand that maybe she's guilty, but we would want to keep her. And I don't think we can dismiss this idea that, if you look at history or you look at the way that Russia has not accounted for its past in the past, it's highly probable that going forward, and you can even talk to oppositionists right now that are coming up with plans and constitutions and reforms for Russia, they understand that they can't toss out everybody in the Russian government or the democratic experiment. It's just not going to work. So if you're technocratic right now, you're in this administration, you're just better off keeping your head down, because most likely no one's going to come for you in a negative way down the line. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be some airing out of what you did at the time of the war and some kind of accountability measure, but it's not going to be as bad as the threats that were leveled at you in the aftermath of the war. Okay, so that's a couple of the main points. That's the kind of Russia part of the book. There's a whole other part of the book on the rest of the world and how Russia is not unique and how this works elsewhere. But I really want to argue that the Russian government is very diverse. And it's not surprising. Hopefully at the end of the talk you understand that. I'm not trying to argue that it's a technocracy or a militocracy or a continuation of the Soviet system or a degenerate autocracy. It's not any of those things. It's a really insidious combination of all of them. And I think that's what makes it so durable. And we need to recognize that diversity and also understand that I'm not trying to argue that technocrats have final say over policy. They have more autonomy in some areas, less autonomy in others, and very rarely have power over the end decision. But that doesn't mean they don't have influence, and that doesn't mean that they haven't had substantial contributions and impact on regime survival. Again, not modernization, but regime survival. And I go through a lot of different areas in the book, in Russia specifically: e-government, surveillance, control over financial transactions, repression, conventionally defined, and also things like bureaucratic accountability, KPIs, coordination centers. What has been the impact of technocrats on the bureaucracy? And I think it's substantial. I don't think it's transformative or revolutionary, but I think it's been very useful for the Putin regime, and we really need to have a discussion about how Russia's changed because these people are in government. So what does that mean for the future, right? Well, I think one thing about people with these backgrounds is that you're only there as long as you deliver. And whereas if you have a personal connection to Putin, you can screw up a lot, and most likely the worst isn't coming for you. Where I think with technocrats, they're only going to be there as long as they can deliver performance, because historically, technocrats have this other function, which is that they're really easy to blame when things go wrong, and you can kind of move forward more quickly. Like Brazil is a good example of this in the 70s and 80s when the military dictatorship was starting to kind of wither. The technocrats were said, oh, they screwed us over, well, we're still okay, give us another shot at carrying things out. So I think that this is the dynamic that we should think about going forward, is that so long as their competence is useful and so long as the challenges that they're given are surmountable, they're probably going to be a part of the Russian governance system. But if things start getting tricky and either they can't step up to the moment, I think they're going to be the first people to fall because of the blame-shifting dynamics historically. The second kind of thought about this, and not just for Russia but also around the world, is the argument that it's easier to make the loyal competent than the competent loyal. It's a little cheaper probably quicker, and in some ways to do that, and maybe you feel a little bit more secure at the end of the day if you build the competence under the loyalty versus vice versa. And there's just been a lot of investment in regimes like Russia, but also China and Vietnam and Saudi Arabia, in order to try to develop what I'm going to call homegrown technocrats, because the world is becoming more divided, not less, and access to Western education, especially my country, is declining. So if you're thinking in the next couple decades how you're going to continue this level of performance, there's more creativity than I think we're having a discussion about. So in Russia, there's the obvious kind of Leaders of Russia program, the School of Governors, School of Mayors. This is serious. This is like a school for gifted kids in Sochi that Putin created about 15 years ago. And if you look at the documents, and when he goes there, he's explicitly saying, we want to develop the highest level of human capital in Russia that is ideologically committed to this regime and all the values that we stand for, right? So there's these programs that are trying to combine training in a very technocratic way with ideological indoctrination. So this is different than, say, what you're seeing with preschools and kindergartens and grade schools, which is more universal. I'm talking about targeted programs to develop internal expertise that might substitute for the access to multinational corporations or Western universities. That's just probably not going to be there, definitely not going to be there in the short term, and probably not in the long run. But there's this big question, is like, can they do this, right? These regimes have benefited from sending their elites to all of our universities for decades. Can they build rivals? Will they allow sufficient academic freedom and create the incentive structures and develop institutions that build capacity within their own countries? What happens when you untether them from the rest of the world? And I think that's a really big open question if you're thinking about authoritarian regime survival going forward, and whether or not they're going to be able to govern at the same high level in the next couple of decades if they're deprived of expertise. But I will say there's already a lot of expertise in a lot of these governments. It's not going to disappear overnight. It could take generations for some of these dynamics to kick in. So what could we do in the broadly defined West? I mean, the main takeaway from this book is that the level of human capital is key to understanding authoritarian nobility. It's not the only key, I think that we've had a lot of good research the last couple of years, for example, about propaganda and censorship. If you've read Guerrilla and Treisman's Spin Dictators, it's obvious that modern dictatorships are savvier and more sophisticated than their predecessors when it comes to information. I see this work as a complement to it. The idea that you can't just trick people and just fool them with propaganda and censorship. You have to do something and deliver good enough governance. So we need to also appreciate the levels of human capital in modern dictatorships. And they've evolved in somewhat similar but also different patterns to the idea of like propaganda and information environment developing that Guerrilla and Treisman draw attention to. So I don't see this as incompatible at all. I see it as very complementary, but it's also distinct because it's more about the people than it is the institutions or the repressive capacity or the media control or the censorship and things like that. It's another dimension to dictatorships, one more for us to track as we try to figure out where these regimes are going. And then there's kind of three provocative suggestions that I'll leave at the end, right? One is we train these elites in our own universities, but we also force them to go back home. My country is the most guilty of this, but there's a lot of instances where maybe we could be better at providing a safe haven, especially if we're coming from a country that we're ideologically opposed to or are in a rivalry with. Like, how do we not just drop that education right back into these governments? Because this is going to show that people go and strengthen those governments, unfortunately, with the tools that we provide them in the West. The second is, I kind of hinted at this idea that sanctions trap competent officials. Like, there's lots of reasons why they don't leave, but sanctions one of them, because there's all this uncertainty and problems with banking and problems with visas and problems just building a new life. And we just have not made it easy for Russians or any other kind of refugees from authoritarian states to integrate in the West. We've done the exact opposite. And I don't think we should just revert to accepting everybody. Of course, there's a lot of problems with that. But why can't we resurrect some of the defections programs that we tried for decades? I'm not saying those are the most effective either. There were problems with this idea of encouraging defectors, but we really tried in the 50s and 60s. The CIA, the UK government, and there's lots of states that came up with defection programs, but we haven't really experimented with them. Again, I'm not arguing that this would work, but I think we want to have a conversation of, if we think that human capital is key to understanding these, well, how do we reduce the level of human capital in these countries? Do we have any tools in the West in order to maybe anticipate some of these things happening and provide refuge before invasions happen, rather than try to scramble after them and then not really having effective policy tools? So of course that's the most provocative, but you can't start a conversation without some things that you disagree with. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, David. I'd invite you to take a seat.
Oh, thank you.
And we will open the floor for questions and comments. So we have a question at the very back. Yes.
Thank you. Jan Rosper from the Institute for Defense Studies. Thank you for this super interesting presentation. I'll certainly read the book. I think one of the takeaways, at least for me, is that you're able to kill this myth, maybe once and for all, that these technocrats are going to save us or save Russia or create a more positive Russia and so on. The second best option could perhaps be that they would go on to serve a more democratic Russia in the future, right? But I would also argue that this very idea, technocracy, is opposed to democracy. Some of them were formerly known as systemic liberals. You don't talk about that, or there's literally no talk about that in the Russian elite now. You have these technocrats. You have one Mishustin, who wants to optimize the governance of Russia the way he optimized the tax service, right? You have Sobyanin with a smart city, Moscow. Every litter box is going to be a sensor to feed data into a fantastic algorithm. You have one Gref, who's collecting massively data from his bank customers, but also from basically from school children in order to optimize the governance. So there's absolutely no democracy there. So there shouldn't be this myth of the technocrats saving us at all, actually. You're doing a great job to kill it, but it's surprising that we had this illusion that they would be good for us or for Russia.
I completely agree, and I've relied on a lot of your work to make those points in the book. So thank you for everything that you've written on this subject. I didn't go into as much detail, but I make a lot of points that you make, and then also try to build in other areas, especially e-government, and show that technocrats introduce, a higher quality of public services that's very electronically, aligned, and they have real impact. But I very explicit in one of the chapters say these are not system liberals. Like, this is at best a misnomer, and at worst very misleading about how we should think about their politics. The big debates in Europe is that exactly technocracy is incompatible with democracy. That if anything, technocracy is closer to populism in the sense that, like, we know better, and I guess there's different approaches to elites, but there's still the idea that citizens shouldn't be a part of the equation, like in a very direct way, especially the way that right-wing populism is right now in my country. It's a small group of people that are making all the decisions. So the one real weakness in this proposal, I think it gets at what you're saying, and I've gotten some pushback on, is we still may need some of these people in a democratic Russia, and it's hard to know whom, and it's hard to evaluate who is able to contribute in that new environment. And I think one of the biggest criticisms of this policy proposal is that we don't know enough about how to spur democratic transitions to say that, like, removing all of the relatively more liberal inclined wouldn't create a worse off authoritarian, repressive, and a lot of human cost because they weren't there to soften the next regime. And I think that's just really open for debate, that I think they still are relatively liberal to everyone else in the elite, and maybe we want to be really cognizant of that fact as we design policies. But I agree with you that they are far from our definition of liberal, and we need to just jettison this idea that we've got co-conspirators inside the Russian government, that if only they were given the opportunity, they would go and, like, unshackle the people from this government. I just think that's really the wrong way of thinking about the state.
Okay, we have lots of questions.
Okay, I'll stop talking. And yeah.
And we have time.
Oh, good.
So I'm not going to be very strict about demanding you have a very quick question. So feel free, but I'm going to try and make sure I do in the order as I was requested. So there was a question from the gentleman with the red tie first. And should I take a few questions, maybe? So if I take from the gentleman in the red tie, and then my colleague Jens, and then Gjerflika, and that's the first three. And then the rest of you I'll come back to you.
Thank you. I believe I'm the one with the red tie. Yes. My name is Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an old age pensioner and independent analyst. You seem to make a special case of Elvira Nabiulina as a kind of competent technocrat who will survive probably from one repressive regime to the next one, or to another non-repressive regime, if that will be the case. In the wake of 22nd of February 22, there were some strong rumors that she had actually asked Mr. Putin to be relieved of her job, to be retired, so to speak, but that he forced her very strongly to stay on. Would that be a typical example of the way Mr. Putin monitors and controls his technocrats? Would that be a typical example? And would you see many other examples within other parts of the apparatus, like the Siloviki and of course the bureaucracy? Thank you.
More questions, or do you prefer to answer?
No, we can take a couple.
Jens?
First, one question, and that is more technical. How do you define a technocrat? Because at least in economics, that I know, you have developed several institutions in Russia that has equal qualification as in any institution in the West. Some of them have gone to the West, but not all. So there are people educated there, even lawyers. Russian lawyers have reached a standard that makes them possible to go straight to the West. There is an institution. Some of the expert on Khodorkovsky is of that kind. That is more technical question. Yes, and also inside Russia, is it any transition between state apparatus and the private sector apparatuses that are also quite large? That's two questions. I have finally a more big kind of comment, and that is when you look at bureaucracies in general, the difference between the bureaucracy inside the democratic state is not that different from a bureaucracy in a dictatorship. All bureaucrats risk can gain promotion, they can be demoted, they can be fired, and so overall, and that is regardless of competence in one sense. Although if you are very competent, the risk is probably less. So and yeah, and also if I was a bureaucrat working in the Yeltsin regime, I would just think about how can I collect money, because you cannot do anything interesting. But if in the first part of the Putin period, you could actually get something done. And that makes you, because all public apparatuses do something good and something bad. Distribution of those are different.
And Professor Giflik at the back is the third question.
Geir Flikke, University of Oslo. Thanks for a great presentation. I was wondering about the balance of power inside of Russia concerning the legislature. But it seems to me that legislation has also been aimed at taming the technocrats and bringing them into line, especially after 2018. And some of the legislation that you would find is directed towards those potential cases that technocrats could do things that are not aligned with the regime. So I just wondered whether you had looked into that specific case. That would also have some implications for regime development, as it were. So that's my question.
Thanks for all the questions. The rumors of her resigning, I think there's equally strong rumors that she never did that. So I am skeptical that we know whether that happened, but I am very open that there was a lot of interest in leaving among the different pockets of effectiveness in the Russian government. People have said hundreds, people have said thousands. Attempts were made. I'm not necessarily sure we should include her. I think she's got a lot to gain by information being released that she tried to, but in reality, there's been just as much reporting that incident never happened. But I think this. I agree that there's demand to exit, and we're not doing a great job of supplying opportunities to exit. And I think that matching has failed in some ways. And I'd like to next time, because there always will be a next time, for us to be a bit more prepared to help people leave, because there will always be people trying to leave, and it may be better for everybody if they were assisted in that way. Yeah, I struggled, of course, obviously with defining technocracy, and I spent a lot of time in the book defending what I do. And I was at Wyszka, or Higher School of Economics, for 10 years. I'm well aware of the increases in educational capacity there, and in Resh particularly, the new economics school. But there are very few people from Resh specifically in the government, and most of those people also spent time abroad, so they are considered technocrats. And there's just so much plagiarism when it comes to dissertations that I'm skeptical of adopting a domestic education criteria for technocracy, while understanding that it is possible. It just introduces so much noise to the measure, and you just don't see the same dynamics for domestic degrees that you do for Western degrees. Like, this really seems like a distinct category of people, even with all the caveats around that are treated differently than people that have advanced within the Russian education system. But I'm not sure that over time that's going to be the same, because the access to Western education is different. But I totally agree with you. I don't want to dismiss Russian universities, but it is, I think, important that a lot of the people that did help build and go through those universities also spent time in the West, and therefore are being captured by this approach. But The alternative is me just telling you this person's a technocrat and this person's not, and then us just arguing indefinitely and then never coming to an understanding. So I adopted a bit more of a transparent way of saying these are the criteria. It doesn't catch everybody, but at least I can show you what I'm doing rather than just behind the scenes being like, I think this person's a technocrat and this one's not because it's really convenient for me, so you should believe me. And then, yeah, I agree that regimes, bureaucracies are really quite similar. I think that's one big point of the book, is that there's nothing distinctive and about, there are things distinctive, but it's not completely foreign when you think about authoritarian regimes. And many of the first meritocratic bureaucracies were in authoritarian states. It's not even that democracy invented meritocratic promotions, like dictatorships did. So that's a big argument of the book. So we shouldn't put them to the side. Although, I think a lot of people did think they could change the world in Yeltsin's government. I think they saw themselves building institutions. Yeah, they could make some money doing it, but they were really excited about the possibilities. And yes, Putin kind of streamlined and built capacity for that to happen and narrowed the realm of options. But I think people went into both governments trying to do good. I'm not trying to say that it's just corrupt, avaricious people trying to make money for themselves. I understand that there's a mixture, but I also just think money matters, especially when your reputation is at risk. And I don't know, we were talking yesterday about like how much, if the Saudi government or some other government contracted us to go consult, like what's our price? It's probably pretty high, but you could probably think of what your price is in order to do some consulting for a government. Hopefully it's really high, but people have different prices, and I think governments recognize that. And then I think you're right. I think my sense is like there's a lot of work, say Ben Noble, who for a long time argued, I think pretty convincingly, that the legislature was being driven by the executive branch for most of the 2000s and 2010s, that we were seeing so much of the legislation come from the ministries, and that legislature was a way for ministries to hash out disagreements rather than the legislature executing oversight over the ministries, which is how it should be constitutionally under a balance of powers. And I think you're absolutely right that under Volodin, things have really changed over the last couple of years in some meaningful ways, and he's trying to kind of reassert the legislature vis-a-vis the bureaucracy to kind of balance the scales a little bit. I don't know how successful that would be over the long run. I don't know how it's a reflection of him personally and his personal ambitions rather than this idea of like separation of powers and real oversight. But I think, yes, that this is being instrumentalized as a tool in order to kind of rein in some of the policy currents. But I do think it's a pretty recent development, and that for most of the last 20 years, the Duma was very subservient to the executive branch, obviously the rubber stamping, but even the policies that were coming out of the Duma were being written by the bureaucrats and then kind of debated, we'll call it, before being sent off to Putin. But I think that's a fantastic point, that like the last couple of years, the legislature is trying to reassert itself in certain domains.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go for another 3 questions, and it was gentlemen. Well, yes, I know. I've got you on my list. I'll definitely come back. There's one more question at the back. I'll write it down. So the first one is from the gentleman with the glasses. Yes.
I'm Rasmus Benestad from the Norwegian Meteorological Institute. In the West, we have this what we think the game changer, the artificial intelligence. And there's a guy called Elon Musk who tried to reduce the technocrats in the US by replacing by artificial intelligence. And I guess in the West, people are very eager, like sharing their information, their thoughts and everything. But I imagine the fearful Russia people keeping their heads down. And we know there's a law of nature, garbage in, garbage out. So you need good quality data in order to make a good prediction, right? So my question is, what does artificial intelligence, what role does it have in, say, Putin's government, like for surveillance and trying to understand and analyze what is actually going on? Because it's actually quite, I think, quite skillful in the West, because we have so much data that we share. We're such an open society. So that I'm just curious.
And then there was a question from Bendik.
Yes. So my question was about I'll just go on. The Siloviki are often described as like the owners of this regime and the system, by Khrushchevskaya, for example. And you didn't really take a stance on that, but I feel like it seems that you're also in line with that line of thinking. But my question was then, what is a technocrat's ability to build their own power base and become players and not just passive pieces that are moved around in the system?
And one more question from my colleague at the Defence Institute.
Yes, Ingrid Opdahl, Institute for Defence Studies. This is really interesting. Obviously, looking at this as a group within the general system of governance of setup, and I'd like your ideas around how this fits in with the broader framework of running an authoritarian regime, with considering legitimacy, participation, because you could even argue that technocrats come as a sort of not just being well, with some caveats, but they can be loyal, they are competent, they can run the whole government, but they come as a sort of a three in one, because they also serve to as a sort of being the backbone of an apolitical, a routinized authoritarian regime. So they sort of they serve that apolitical side of a modern autocracy, or many modern autocracies, and they also they sort of not just deflect criticism, but they also reflect well on the president, because a president or a leader can run the sort of the personalist side of things and have some there can be some nice photos of him, and he can do stuff, but they then reflect well on that. You know, they serve him. So your comments on that? Yeah.
Sure. Great. So to take them in order, what role does AI play in Putin's regime? First, things are really opaque, so I don't want to overclaim in terms of us understanding the way that AI is being interpreted or being incorporated, because we're just not getting anything close to the information we got before the war about that. We observe a lot more of the resources that are being invested in AI, the programs, and the bureaucratic processes kicking into high gear rather than the outcomes and the actual applications and how they're changing before and after type, what's the impact of AI and the way the government services operate. I talk a lot in the book about like the idea of digital special forces under Mishustin, and the way that I show data that ministries run by technocrats, for example, have higher AI adoption rates and are investing more in these tools than other places that have less exposure to this. It's one of the chapters really goes into this idea of like capacity from technocrats in these modern applications. I think the other thing to think about is that I'm just really scared about AI in places like Russia. I don't think in the West we have any real guardrails, and if we don't have guardrails, then we should just completely expect even worse in the rest of the world in terms of data protection, in terms of what this is suitable for, the type of purposes and outcomes. And I haven't seen anything to suggest that the Putin regime is worried or concerned about backlash or kind of constrained to not adopt AI wherever possible, that it meets its goals of repression and surveillance and control. And I think we've seen that in China, for example, and I just think Russia's an alarming case, and I'm already alarmed by what my country's doing. I'm even more concerned about what other countries are not doing. Siloviki is owners of the regime. This is not a criminology book, and I will never write a criminology book. There was a lot of that stuff. I love reading it, and there's a lot of insights from it. But I'm not a Russian. I'm not a Russian insider. This is a little bit more of a distant, more neutral kind of how do we contextualize and think about Russia, looking at things that we can have a conversation about rather than comparing rumors of relative power. I think in this book, I really think that there are many factions within the government. I think there's a decision maker at the top that adjudicates between those factions. I think fortunes rise and fall over time based on how well they perform. I think understanding performance as one of the big criteria for promotions or demotions or relative power is something we really need to internalize rather than just closeness to the principle. And we've seen in the last year that Siloviki have come under fire, and anti-corruption investigations at lower levels of Siloviki are at an all-time high, and suggest that there's this discontent within that principle about how well things are going on the military repressive front, and that there needs to be some reining in of the Siloviki. So I think
in general, Siloviki probably have had the upper hand over technocrats in most areas, but the technocrats, because of their performance, have been able to protect autonomy in a lot of other areas, not just in the economic bloc, but in the digital bloc and in other cultural and education areas. We have a lot of examples of them being able to push back against a lot of Siloviki ideas. But I think the stasis in the Russian government over time is reflected by there being more balance between the factions rather than like one always winning over the other. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the final decisions are in the head of one person, and that just makes a lot more fluidity in the system, I think, by design. But no, I can't wade into, like, at this point in time, we have definitive evidence that this bloc was stronger than the other. I think we can read the tea leaves and have a conversation, but I'm kind of, like, refraining from entering those debates, I think, hopefully for obvious reasons. It's just not that kind of exercise. And then I think I got your question to be how they changed the image of the regime. And
well, yeah, they have a function there as well.
I think you're totally right. I mean, the stories that I've gotten is like they have exceptional taste in wine for people that have really come into status quite recently. Like they kind of skipped the nouveau riche stage of luxury development, that they are very sophisticated individuals who present extremely well and for foreign and domestic audiences, for foreign and domestic corporations that do well on television. Mishustin might not be the most charismatic person, but he is very convincing and compelling as an executor, as a manager, somebody you would trust with power. And I think these regimes care about that image in the same way that we learned from Gruyev and Treisman that you want to control the informational environment, is that technocrats provide a really nice polished image of a modernizing regime, even if some of it is a Potemkin village and it's not as crazy and revolutionary underneath. But you can't really do good propaganda in many cases unless you can present something. And I think technocrats are something that are often trotted out and saying, don't worry, we've got this under control. You can have faith that we'll get through this next challenge because look at how well we speak and we organize and we present themselves. So yeah, I think that is part of it, but of course that's hard to measure, and like it's a bit more of a qualitative discussion than saying like definitively technocrats have helped improve Putin's image by this compared to him riding shirtless on a horseback or some other type of entreats to the population.
So there's three very patient people at the back that want to ask questions, and it's first of all, yes, so you know who you are. So there's 1 and 2 and 3. Yes, you can go first. Yes, in the red shirt.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you. My name is Susanna Sabo, independent journalist, and first of all, thank you for the engaging and very insightful presentation. And here comes my question. My home country is Hungary, and you may probably know what's going on there. I used to work there as a foreign policy journalist until we were let to do so. Then I left the country. And for example, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but he is not only the one who actually likes copying what's going on and what is built in Russia. So what Europe and modern Western societies could do better to shield them off to the exposure of such systems. For example, in Hungary, I'm also seeing that more and more Western educated young faces turn up, which reminds me really much so what you were giving just a presentation to us, what's happening in Russia, and which is literally the survival of these very systems. Thank you.
I'm Gro Holm from the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, recently corresponding in Russia. First, I just wanted to have this comment on the AI. That was the question. There is a Russian AI alliance where Sberbank with German Greff is the director, is active. Gazprom and also Yandex, which is it's Google++ in Russia. So, and I was listening to German Greff last March when he talked about it. He paid lip service to the protection of individuals in this new AI world, but that was lip service. Okay. I have a question because I think it was last week that the news came that in Russian schools they will reduce the number of lessons in foreign languages, which is mainly English, and knowledge about society and social sciences. The beneficiaries will be history and patriotic education. So this reminds us that not all are busy thinking about import substitution of technocrats in Russia. Is there a discussion in the Russian society and, for instance, in the Duma, about how you should develop this part of the society on your own to substitute and to complement, to get new people into the system instead of those who had actually education in the West? And that includes foreign language and social sciences.
And there was one more question in the back corner, yes.
Hi, my name is Daniela Slavinsky, and thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. So, I was wondering if you had any ideas on how your arguments may relate to your colleagues' work, Henry Hale's model on patrol politics, because in your presentation it seems like indeed the technocrats are embedded in the regime, they are stakeholders, so to say, but you haven't talked much about whether and how they may be integrated into informal networks, clans, and how they may use those for rents or rewards or other kinds of spoils. Or are they simply just left alone to do their jobs and receiving high wages? Thank you.
Great questions. Yeah, on Hungary, I think Hungary is one of these cases where the newly ascendant leader is very cocky and arrogant in the beginning, achieves a lot of goals, especially self-enrichment, and then realizes that their popularity depends on having to do more, and then evolves into somebody more open to technocratic thinking. What I've seen in Hungary, and the examples probably know way better, is that there are a couple high-profile examples in high levels of government that have only gained influence over the last 4 or 5 years. So I think the general point is that dictators learn over time, and their preferences for technocracy are often more fluid than you think. Some don't. You can see a little in the data, some are older and less open to change, and some are younger and evolve over their time in office. And I think Orban is a good example of that, but he's not unique in terms of appreciating expertise differently based on challenges or his own experience and things like that. So there's fewer examples of dictators doing the same thing over the course and more of them becoming smarter, obviously, but of course there's examples to the contrary as well. The idea of this restricting access to foreign education, I totally agree. I think in a lot of ways the regime speaks out of both sides of its mouth, right? And there's probably a better way to think about it. It's like a hierarchy, right? There's no English or social sciences for the masses, because if you learn that stuff, you can consume foreign media and get a lot of crazy ideas in your head and disrupt. But we're still appreciative of those type of capacities now for certain elite occupations and functions. But I think you're right that there's this hope that we can import substitute technocracy over the next couple generations, because we just don't like the idea of importing it from the West anymore, right? And that's this idea of these like leader programs, the gifted programs, the technocratic training programs, the GREF, summits and training sessions and investment in really are close to executive education for bureaucrats to train them in a very technical but also politically palatable type of governance model. And Russia's not unique in this. Like, there's schools popping up across dictatorships to try to create your own Harvard Kennedy School locally so that you don't have to go abroad. But I think whether they share amongst themselves how to do this, but I think it's going to be really hard unless they have Western consultants to come in, and professors like people in this room who are probably really loath to traveling to Russia to build this institutional capacity. So in some ways they're kind of late, and they probably should have done this before they invaded Ukraine to pull it off. And I don't know if they'll ever be able to catch up because of the restrictions on there. But not for you, but for me kind of thing in terms of the English and social sciences, because I think they're worried about the societal effects of exposure to ideas, and why not, if we can control the curriculum, do it now so that we don't have to worry about it in 20 years and create another urban class of dissenters like we've had to deal with in the past decade. And then patronal politics. Yeah, there obviously wasn't time in the talk to talk, for example, about system liberals and all the AI and the networks, right? There's a lot
It's in the book, but I had 30 minutes, so I apologize for not covering everything. I guess that's why we do this. Yeah, there's evidence that they get to bring in their own when you get appointed, that you get a couple appointees, and a lot of times there's this alignment that you bring in people with profiles that are similar to your own, and you can build teams. Like Mishustin came with 6 or 7 other technocratic ministers, and it looks like he had some influence over their choice, or at least wasn't opposed to them taking over ministries. Like Shadayev was a good example of a technocrat taking power at the same time. It's protective. I think we have examples of technocrats performing roles of patrons for those people. They get in trouble, and I can help bail you out within reason, not every time, but I can soften the blow or at least deflect some of the investigations. But it looks like when the gears of justice, in quotations, start running, technocrats are maybe a little bit more limited in what they can do. Now, it's hard to say that across ministries we have networks in the same way. I am hesitant to say that. I think within a ministry, Nabulna or Sliranov or I don't know, Shadayev, they have probably, I think we could think of it as a network or at least a patronage type formation under them, but I've seen less evidence that there's as much like cross-fertilization, and there's very little evidence of rotation in the Putin government, I think by design. So I think there's a lot of these type of patronage groups, but it's much more decentralized and much more fragmented than we like to use the Kremlin towers metaphor. I just don't think it's as consolidated. So when I use technocrats as a group, I'm not trying to even imply that they all get together and coordinate action, but that doesn't mean within that group there aren't different patrons that I think are there because they're able to kind of build their own type network. But this stuff is really hard to observe and make claims on. So again, I don't want to like, what's the metaphor? Ski over my boots or whatever it is. Use the correct skiing metaphor. Get too far ahead of my skis by claiming that's the worst joke to use for an audience of skiers. But yeah, you can tell us that some things I'll make claims on, and other ones I don't want to overstate.
Okay, so 2 more questions. One from the gentleman in the orange shirt, and then 2 rows back. There's another question. Sorry.
Okay. My name is Sverre Rustad. I worked for 6 years at the Norwegian Embassy in Moscow. Part of the time as Counselor for Education and Science. I visited many of the top universities and spoke to the rectors and vice-rectors and so on. The rectors, incidentally, usually don't speak English. On your question, can Russia build its own expertise? I think the answer is clearly no. Depends which subject you talk about, of course, but if you look at economics, for instance, many of the top economists have long left Russia, long since, like people like Guriev or Sonin or Alexachenko. And Nabiela's husband, Yaroslav Kuzminov, founded the Higher School of Economics, but has now been forced out. If you look at history, it's obviously used as a platform for fostering patriotism, and so on. But actually, some years ago there was an open debate on whether Russia was concentrating on the right subjects in research. Physics is the top subject, has immense prestige. But people were saying, while the West is concentrating on biotechnology, life sciences and so on, Russia is stuck with the technologies of the 20th century, like nuclear technology, like laser technology, like space technology and so on. But I think my point is really that there has never been any institutional autonomy for Russian universities. There's been very little academic freedom, and to the extent that there has been any academic freedom, I think it's gone. It's now all ideology. Higher education is being militarized as well, so it's really a bleak picture.
Gentleman, 2 rows back. You have a question as well?
Yeah. Svein Flåte, I'm a petroleum engineer. I've been working with low-level Russian technocrats for some time. To me, when you talk about technocrat, you also talk about competence. And competence is divided in 3 parts: pure knowledge, experience, using your knowledge, and attitude. And to me, attitude is linked to the soft power of the West. So to me, it's very important that we have this bridge towards the Russians and the Eastern people when it comes to attitude. I think that's a long-lasting value, and if you can really give people some attitudes, staying in the West for some time, they will bring that with them for the rest of life. Like you mentioned Elvira, she was at Yale Fellow just for 3 months. I think it made a lasting impression on her and may have impacted her later. Just a comment.
Sure. So I share your skepticism of whether or not Russia can do this. I think we still need to track what it's trying to do, but I wouldn't put a lot of money that it's going to be able to pull it off for all the reasons that you've said. I think it's interesting that there was this experimenting with bringing Western expertise into higher education. I mean, I was a part of that. I spent 10 years off and on, a couple months for 10 years to build this type of collaborative Russian-American joint center in the social sciences, which was just destroyed. But there's Skolkovo is another one of these examples where they tried to import Western higher education standards to varying success, I might say. But one thing I want to just appreciate is that the Russian government is also unpredictable in some ways and can advance, for example, in tax or in areas where you didn't anticipate there to be these breakthroughs and building of state capacity. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that with limited aims, they might be able to do what they need to in order to develop this technocratic expertise in certain subject areas. I agree. You could add nanotechnology to that list of sectors that they, ill-advisedly adopted. And I think if you're trying to modernize a country, yeah, I wouldn't put a lot of money into Russia. But if you're trying to keep political stability and inertia and the status quo, I think the government is quite good at developing the type of capacities to do that. And I think that's the scary part, is that it neither sinks or swims. It just kind of keeps muddling along indefinitely. And unfortunately, the longer it stays in power, the more the rest of the world suffers. So again, I want to lower our expectations for what Russian technocrats are capable of pulling off, or higher education is capable of doing, while understanding that it's not the opposite, where things are just collapsing and that the state capacity is withering and governance is dying. I think that's not the way to think about it either. That's a great way of thinking about competence. Yeah, I share definitely the first two, and the attitudes I think is important. There's done a lot of work showing that Russians are way more democratically inclined than we give credit for, and that, for example, if you tell them about all the bad stuff happening with elections, they get quite angry and they think that things are better than they are. So a little bit of information and exchange across borders would go a long way with Russians, because they share a lot of the values that we do in the West, but have a different understanding about how well those values are being actualized within their government. So there's the gap. And I'm not trying to advocate cutting off technocrats from the West, and if anything, I'm trying to say we should have better communication across borders, and so that if you do want to leave, we can have that conversation. But if you do want to stay, there is signaling. I'm sure this is being done in intelligence communities. I'm sure there's conversations happening. I don't know any of them, of course, but I just want to make sure that we do keep ties open with people that are relatively liberal and focus on them in some ways. And figure out a good strategy towards dealing with them, because I do think they play this integral role within the regime.
Question from...
Yes, Julie Wilhelmsen, I'm a research professor here at NUPI. First of all, thank you so much for coming.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I'm saying thank you for coming. It's really a great intervention for us to have here. And then I also appreciate your kind of distanced approach. We need more of it. But I would like you to expand a bit, maybe it's criminology, I don't know, but on the observations of how Putin seemed to be much more in a bubble with visionaries before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, or the full-scale invasion. And whether it would be true that he has managed to get out of that bubble to some extent. If you just could share some impressions. Is he relying more on technocrats again to make sure that he keeps his power at home? has been the trajectory after the start of the war?
That's a great question. Can I tag on to that?
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, it's a slightly different way of approaching that question. You've talked about how much resources go into this modernization programs and discourse of transforming Russia since 1999, all the way through. We'll have different incarnations of it. Vladimir Gelman has written a lot about that. He said bad governance is combined with pockets of efficiency. I didn't really hear your take on. I think you're making a very good. You're pulling our focus back to this as a kind of central, sort of stabilizing factor of the regime's overall stability and legitimacy. So the question is, obviously, how do you interpret the shift of modernization models since 2022? Because prior to 2022, some people might say that Russia was caught in a middle income trap, it had a lot of economic stagnation, it was struggling to implement national projects. Now it's spending money everywhere. As far as I can tell, by all accounts, $1 trillion on this war, and the investment is all across the country. So I thought you might have something to just tag us on with Julie's question of before and after 2022. What does that mean for elite coalitions? What does that mean, all that money that's moving around the country? The military Keynesianism, as some observers have called it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the license to speculate. I'm glad this is being live streamed so I can be held accountable for all my misguided interpretations. Yeah, I am under the impression that the bubble has been partly pierced because of the disastrous performance of the military, and that he's been forced to acknowledge that the extent of the decay in certain parts of the government. I think that has improved the technocrat standing, especially during moments like Prigozhin when they stayed put, and that there's been this. I mean, there's one interpretation of the technocrats is that they just kind of quiet quit. That's what we call it in America. They just showed up to work, this presentism, and they introduced some kind of sabotage by not doing anything within the government. But they also didn't actively sabotage, and I think if you're just trying to observe performance, you get a real positive impression of their contribution since the war and also their continued loyalty to the project, especially after things that kind of, I don't know, clarified 6 months into the war. And I think there's this understanding that a lot of people wanted to leave, but those that stayed maybe have adjusted and adapted to this wartime reality and can be relied on going forward. So it does seem that, especially the last 2 years, there's been, like we were talking about the Siloviki or the anti-corruption, this idea that like performance is going to matter a lot more, and if you're not performing well, or if you're stealing too much, this is not the time for it. We don't have the tolerance. There's just not excess cash anymore. So step up or get out. And if you refuse to get out or if you've behaved too badly, we're going to make an example out of you because we just can't tolerate this kind of ridiculously bad performance in certain areas because the regime is under existential crisis in some way. And I think under those conditions, technocrats look relatively good because they're at least performing above the median, and I think have accumulated a lot of kind of status and trust by not actively hurting Russia's ability to carry out the war and repress its citizens. So yeah, I think again it's another example of like changes in leader effectiveness over time. I think Putin got really arrogant and maybe paranoid and definitely isolated in the pre-war period, but it doesn't mean that that's a permanent characteristic of him. And I think he's extremely adaptable and very intelligent. That doesn't mean he's going to just remake himself, but that doesn't. He can also empower other people at certain points based on the information he has, and I think that's probably one of the more scary elements of his leadership. So the idea of the spending in the military Keynesianism and how this model has changed. I think there's a lot of disappointment among the Russian technocrats with like even the publicized goals of modernization just completely collapsing and falling off the agenda, that the war has basically dominated any talk of structural change or improvement on all these different dimensions. You don't hear about national projects. You don't even get lip service to a lot of the stuff you did in the pre-war period. Everything is focused on stabilization and keeping employment on there and military production and reintegration of veterans and like projection of power. And I would think technocrats care about none of that stuff when they go home. That's not why they entered the government, and now they have even fewer resources to do anything on the margins that they might care about. So I think, but there is this also idea, so like if we can get through this, if we can get to a peace deal, if we can stop this war, then we have to go back to the way things were, because when we reduce the military spending, the economy is going to get so much worse. We have to think about long-term investments, and we have to go back to this modernization paradigm. We're in this like weird purgatory right now, where the country's neither collapsing, but we can't invest in the things that we want to. But as long as we're patient, there might be opportunity down the line, and I think that strategic patience you can see that in the way that some of the policymakers are talking and pushing back against some of the ideas, saying we can't forget, let's not lose sight about Russia in 10 or 20 years. We can't just think about getting through the next 3 months or the next 6 months, which I think is really the short-termism about this regime, and has been really fortunate that like it had the money to adopt such a short-term mentality. But yeah, I see no long-term strategic visions propagated anymore in Russia, and it's hard to govern any country without giving people hope for what's coming. So I think at some point they're going to have to go back to like a more developmental model in order to satisfy citizens. Like we did 5 years of this horrendous war. What's coming next? When are we ever going to go back to the early 2000s? Because I'm getting a little impatient, and I want to make sure my kids lead a better life than I did.
Excellent. Well, we're running out of time, but since we are a research community, I thought we could just have one final short question.
Sure.
Based on the book you've just written and what you've been talking about today, you might say a few words about what you think the Russian expert community in the West kind of got wrong or fell short. Not too many things, but then in the Norwegian tradition of always presenting problems as challenges to be solved, you might also point out where you think a couple of areas of future research what you think needs to be invested in.
Yeah, I heard a speaker at a conference the other day that his partner was a school teacher, so he couldn't identify problems in the research. He could only identify areas for improvement. So areas for improvement for the Russian studies. I think one really appreciating expertise among Russian refugees is a hugely important one, and we're going to lose immensely by not providing opportunities for people displaced by the war and relying on our own homegrown experts that have weaker and weaker ties to Russia as the years go on for obvious reasons. So I think we need to do a better job of providing places and resources and opportunities for Russians to help us understand Russia, because I think most of the Russians that have left the war have sufficiently demonstrated opposition to it, and it can really help us understand how to develop policy. I think that wherever possible, there can still be exchange with Russian institutions, but it's just really tricky. And but I think there are other ways of creating that exchange and getting information to flow across borders that I don't think we're appreciative enough about. And then there's also a risk of, like, at least in my country, just a lost generation of people that just never got to go abroad, that never really got the language training at the sufficient level. There's just, my government is destroying fellowship programs and scholarship programs and expertise, and that you don't see that effect for another 10 or 15 years. So we need private sources or other governments to step in, or I'm really worried about, unfortunately, when I'm a senior scholar, who's going to step up and do this type of research. And then I think just an openness to ideas sometimes, right? There's oftentimes the conversation has to go a certain way because of a kind of a set narrative. I don't think I've ever felt censored or uncomfortable, but I think oftentimes there's a desired way of thinking about the way the Russian government works that doesn't necessarily get reflected in the evidence and facts that we have. There's like a bit of motivated reasoning. So making sure that we're bringing the best data and the best evidence, the best information to substantiate arguments rather than our preferred interpretation. But I don't think that's that damaging. It's not like I think about that a lot, but there are cases where I'm just like, I want you to kind of back up with what you're saying, rather than just saying what you think other people want to hear.
Excellent. These are really excellent points. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming and attending and engaging with David's work. I also want to thank you, David, for finding the time in your busy schedule to let us engage with your work, and wish you all the best with the forthcoming book, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all for the great